So today is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Hayley Clements from the University of Stellenbosch and Professor Ara Monadjem from the University of Eswatini, who will be talking to us about quantifying a Biodiversity Intactness Index for Africa. Welcome, thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to you, Hayley.
Thanks very much, Elisa. Thanks for having us here today. It's really nice to be able to present some of our early findings to you all. I am going to share my screen now. Elisa, can you see my, my slide presentation full? Perfect. Okay. I'm also in the field at the moment, so I'm hopeful that the internet plays along, but we will try our best. So as Elisa says, I'm a researcher at Stellenbosch University. I'm an ecologist by training. My interests lie in understanding the links between biodiversity and human well-being, and also in exploring resilient and equitable conservation opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is some results from a 3-year project that I'm leading on quantifying a Biodiversity Intactness Index for Africa. Today we're going to be sharing specifically the results from our BAT expert elicitation, which was led by Professor Ara Monadjem. So the reason for this project, which is funded by Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer Research Grant, is that, of course, as we all know, there are projections of rapid socioeconomic growth in Africa over the next decade. And what that means is it's really critical that we act now to navigate that development in a way that is sustainable and that does not erode biodiversity beyond a boundary by which human well-being is negatively affected through the implications of that biodiversity loss for ecosystem function. And of course, this requires a measure of what biodiversity remains, where and how losses of biodiversity ultimately influence ecosystem function and thereby human well-being. Now, part of guiding development or encouraging development in a sustainable way is through guiding global policy discourses and agreements that feed down into national decision-making and planning. And these global policy discourses make use of biodiversity targets that countries agree to and that are then assessed using aggregated biodiversity indices. Now, many of the existing biodiversity indices are limited by data availability, and as a result, they often focus only on a proxy of biodiversity and biodiversity loss, something like habitat and habitat loss, or by species presence absence, or for example, by the level of threat to species. And while these are useful starting indicators, they don't tell us everything we need to know about how losses in biodiversity translate into losses in ecosystem function, which is what we ultimately need to know about. And so the aim of this project is to address this knowledge gap by quantifying a Biodiversity Intactness Index for Africa, and importantly, to do this through an Africa-wide collaboration of biodiversity experts. So to introduce you to the index itself, the Biodiversity Intactness Index was first proposed in a paper by Bob Scholes and Unsi Bix, who are involved in this project as well. And it's an aggregated index that assesses the average impact of human land use activities on the abundance of diverse species in a region. This region can be a province, a country, a continent. One of the values of the index is that it's scale flexible. And importantly, it's a relative index. So it assesses the impact of human land use activities on population abundances relative to what we would have expected in a region before modern industrial society. Now, this can be challenging to conceptualize, and a more contemporary alternative is to think of a reference relative to a large, well-managed modern-day protected area. Now, what this makes this index different from some of the others is that it focuses on abundance, and it focuses on abundance of a large and diverse set of species. For this project, we're focusing on all vertebrates as well as the key plant groups. And so the idea is, because it focuses on abundance and of a large diversity of species, it gets us closer towards capturing the role of biodiversity in ecosystem function than if we just focused on presence, absence, or level of threat. Now, because of its ability to capture aspects of function through its focus on abundance, this index has been proposed as a potential indicator of the biodiversity planetary boundary, which is one of 9 planetary boundaries that collectively delimit a safe operating space for humanity, with the idea being that if we overstep any of these boundaries through anthropogenic change, we risk eroding the resilience of the Earth system to function and to remain in Holocene-like conditions, which are the only conditions that we know for certain human civilization can develop and thrive. So some of these boundaries may be more familiar to you. For example, a climate change boundary is 350 parts per million of CO2. There's a genetic diversity boundary of less than 10 extinctions per million species years. There's a land use change boundary of we shouldn't lose more than 25% of our forests, etc. But you'll see here with the white arrow that the functional diversity boundary, which is largely considered to be one of the 2 core planetary boundaries together with climate change in terms of contributing to Earth system functioning. People don't yet know how to effectively measure. What metric is a good metric to measure this planetary boundary of how much biodiversity loss we can stand before we start losing ecosystem function, and where the threshold lies. And the Biodiversity Intactness Index is an index that has been proposed as a way to capture this biodiversity planetary boundary. There's also, as you will know, much discussion at the moment regarding post-CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity targets, and the Biodiversity Intactness Index is also proposed as a way to measure the goal of goals around species composition and abundance. So it's increasingly put forward towards as a target towards those goals. And I also think that it's potentially useful in informing the IUCN Red List on ecosystems, which has a focus on ecosystem intactness, ecosystem condition, and potential boundaries that lead to loss of condition in ecosystems. So getting to how the index is quantified, ideally what we would like is to be able to understand the impact of the multitude of different types of land uses, human activities across the continent, how those different land uses impact on the abundance of every species in sub-Saharan Africa. But of course, in reality, that would be very impractical. And so to calculate the Biodiversity Intactness Index, we make 2 simplifications. The first is that we take the huge diversity of land uses that we see, or anthropogenic land use change that we see across sub-Saharan Africa, and we categorize those into 9 distinct landscape types that have distinct types of land cover, land use, human activity, etc. And I'll speak to those in more detail a little bit later. And then the second simplification that we make is, instead of trying to estimate the impact of each of these landscapes on every species in sub-Saharan Africa, we cluster species into groups that we anticipate to respond similarly to land use change because of their behavior, their ecology, things like their diet, their size, their reproductive strategy, etc. And Ara will speak to this in more detail for bats in a little bit. So we first categorize species into their main different groups. So I'm looking at mammals divided into small mammals, mesocarnivores, large herbivores and large carnivores, primates, etc. And then also birds. At the moment, we're doing reptiles and amphibians, and then we'll also do the main plant groups. So what we then do is, at the heart of the Biodiversity Intactness Index calculation are impact scores. And the impact scores are the mean abundance of a given group of species in a given landscape type relative to what we would have expected the mean abundance of that species group to be in a reference population. Now, again, a reference population is pre-industrial, or if that's hard to think about a large, well-managed protected area. So these scores are relative scores, so they typically between 0, which is there's no species that should be there, there's no individuals of those species left in that landscape, through to 0.5 is 50% of the original abundance compared to a reference population is left in that landscape, through to 1 or 100%, which is it's pristine, there's no negative impact of that landscape on average on that group of species. These scores can also go above 1 for species that actually respond very well to human land use change. They're in the minority, but that is a possibility. But we cap it at 2 so that we don't end up with exponential values or outliers to the top. These impact scores that are really core to the Biodiversity Intactness Index then feed into this algorithm. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I is those impact scores for each of those species groups in each of the landscapes, and then essentially those impact scores are weighted relative to the number of species in a given group, in a given region, be it an ecoregion, for example, as well as the area of the different landscape types. So again, the impact scores are on a scale of typically 0 to 1. They then get aggregated through a weighting process that considers the area of different landscapes as well as the richness of different species in the groups in that area. So the BII itself is also typically on a scale of 0 to 1, where 1 is intact or 100%. So this index was originally proposed by Bob Scholes and Unsi Biggs, as I mentioned, who undertook a process of expert elicitation to estimate those impact scores for species in a couple of countries in Southern Africa. There was then a more recent paper about a decade later, so in 2016, that actually tried to quantify the biodiversity intactness of the world through using empirical data that came from the PREDICTS database. So some of you may be familiar with this database. It's an aggregation of all available species presence and abundance data from around the world. This map shows you where the data come from. Circles are bigger if there's more data from those areas. And as you can see, there are notable gaps in this data. If you look at Africa, you'll see there's large geographic biases in terms of where data come from. There's also biases taxonomically. For example, birds represent quite a considerable portion of the data compared to other taxonomic groups. And because of these data biases, and because they tried to model this globally, so looking at how species on average are impacted, their abundance in different land use types relative to other data that's been collected in natural vegetation, because it was extrapolated globally, this is what their index looks like. And there's been quite a lot of criticism in terms of how relevant it really is. So if you look at this map, you can see the black and the red are low biodiversity intactness, up to, so this is the 0 to 1 scale here has been converted into percentages. So 100% is completely intact. And you'll see some strange trends here if you focus in on Africa, where the more arid areas typically have much lower biodiversity intactness. This doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. People have criticized it, and it seems that one of the core issues is that they considered all rangelands to be pasturelands, and based on data from elsewhere in the world, pasturelands are really bad for biodiversity, and so that extrapolated across the African continent looks like this. And so really, you know, the index is potentially very useful, but the way it's been applied is quite problematic. And so what this project is proposing to do is to go back to expert elicitation, because we have limitations in the empirical data that are available, and to ask the experts in African biodiversity to estimate those impact scores for Africa specifically. So pushing it back against this global approach. Now, expert elicitation is widely used across a range of fields. It's commonly used in environmental science and conservation in particular. So for example, there's expert elicitation in the intergovernmental panels on climate change and on biodiversity and ecosystem services. There's expert opinion or expert knowledge in the red list. If you start looking in papers, you'll see there's often expert information that informs parameters and models, etc. So it's widely used, but of course, experts are people, and people are subject to their own inherent biases. And so there's now actually a whole field of research designed around how do we make expert elicitation as rigorous as possible, and essentially how do we treat expert elicitation like a formal data collection process. These protocols incorporate research from mathematics, psychology, decision theory, etc., aimed at reducing biases and increasing transparency, accuracy, and defensibility. So the process that we're using for this project is called the IDEA protocol, where IDEA stands for investigate, discuss, estimate, and aggregate. And to just give you a sense of what that timeline looks like, I've put in the process for the BAT expert elicitation that we ran in particular in November. What we do is we convene experts into an introductory meeting where we explain what we'd like them to do. They then have opportunity to ask questions, etc. And then they have 2 weeks to undertake the expert elicitation, make the impact score estimates themselves. We aggregate that information and then reconvene in an online meeting to present the initial results back to experts, to interrogate sources of uncertainty, discuss what we see, etc. And then experts have an opportunity, if they gained any additional information through that discussion that helped clarify things or challenge their original perspectives, they then have another week to revise their estimates. And the objective is absolutely not to reach consensus. It's important also to capture differences and uncertainty. It's just to help interrogate individual biases and uncertainties that might influence results. So, as I mentioned, this is a project that is running these expert elicitations across vertebrate groups as well as plants. And the process is that I reached out to Ara. I'm not a small mammal expert by any means. So I reached out to Ara and asked him if he would be willing to contribute his expertise to helping think through the small mammal component of the research, of which bats is one component. We also did insectivores and rodents. And then he reached out to his networks across the world that have expertise in African bats. So 32 experts were invited, and the intention here was very much to ensure that we had a good distribution of expert knowledge across different regions in Africa. You can see there of the 24 experts that agreed to participate, their expertise across the different regions, central, east, southern, and west. And we were also very cognizant to try and avoid a bias to one region, for example, having more Southern African experts than elsewhere. So that was the intention there. The experts themselves came from 17 countries around the world. You can see those countries in the map that I've showed, and really an incredible wealth of expertise in African bats that agreed to contribute to this process. On average, 15 years of experience, collectively hundreds of years of experience, and having served on various advisory roles as well. I see some of the experts on this call as well, so hello, and thank you again for participating in this project. So just to talk again about what it is that we asked these experts to do. The first process was to describe to them the different landscapes that we wanted them to picture when making their estimates, and I'm going to talk to that in more detail. The second was to discuss with them the proposed groupings of bats into categories that we expect to respond similarly to land use change, because we could not do each bat individually. And then, having described the landscapes and the groups to experts, we asked them to fill in a spreadsheet which they provided their estimates of what they expected the impact of a given landscape to be on the relative abundance of a given group of bat species, again on a scale of 0 to 1 typically, though it could be up to 2 for species that perform well. So just to talk through the two components, the landscapes and then the species groups. As I mentioned, it's infinite diversity of land uses across the continent. So the first step was to categorize these into very broad categories of similar land uses, land covers, and human activities, also following other research that's been done and what's in the predicts database, which enables us to also compare our scores to empirical data for species where there is actual abundance data. So these are the categories here that you can see. Now, of course, within each of these, there's also a huge degree of variability in what these landscapes actually look like on the ground, a high degree of variability in intensity. And so instead of asking experts to estimate the impact of these very broad categories on different groups of species, we rather describe to them a much more specific landscape within each type. So for example, in the urban category, we describe to them, imagine a very dense urban center. Mixed settlements, we describe to them a landscape that has houses, that has green patches, that has a certain density of people living in it, etc. So just to give you one example, which is for the smallholder croplands, we provided photos of what these kinds of landscapes could look like. And then we provided a description of the type of landscape that we would like experts to visualize when making their estimates. So here, for example, we talk about the size of the fields, typically what types of croplands are in those fields, the types of activities in terms of like minimal fertilizer, etc., that happens, etc. So really what these categories we're trying to capture is a low and high intensity landscape within each of the broad land uses and covers. And again, we asked experts to estimate for these very specific landscapes that really fall along a continuum of land use and land intensity, that we can then use those scores as waypoints to ultimately extrapolate to estimate biodiversity and intactness across the continent, across a much higher diversity of land uses. So it was really to promote consistency in the scores. The second dimension was to think through the species groups. Now, again, we couldn't list all bat species for experts to estimate the impact of landscapes on. It just would have been impossible. And so the idea was to think through groupings of species in terms of species that were likely to respond in similar ways to landscape change. And again, I'm absolutely not a bat expert, so I approached Ara and asked him if he would be willing to think through this, to propose some species groups that we could then present to the group of experts in the introductory meeting to get their feedback on, and ultimately to come up with a final list for them to estimate impact scores for. So at this point, I'm going to, sorry, this was just to say that those proposed estimates or those proposed groupings that Ara put together, he presented to the group in the introductory meeting. We had a discussion about that, and then based on that, we revised the groups for the expert elicitation. So in a sense, these groupings of species were also expert elicited. I'm now going to hand over to Ara. Hopefully his internet is holding out, to talk us through the process of defining these bat species groups.
Thanks, Hayley. Thanks, Elisa. Thanks to all of you for attending. And yes, unfortunately, my internet has held out. I had hoped that it would cut and then Hayley would have to present my section as well. So as Hayley mentioned, the first task I was asked to do was to decide on the bat species groups, how to group our very diverse bat community in Africa into a manageable number of groups, around 10 to 12 groups she proposed, that would respond to land use changes in a similar way. And two things came to my mind. One was foraging guild and the other was roosts. And based on these two, I made up an initial set of groups, which I presented to the at the first meeting to the experts. And my groupings were so terrible that they were shut down immediately. And through the process of discussion that followed, we actually came up with, I think, much better way of grouping the bats. What I had done is I had looked at the foraging guild first. In fact, I'd looked at whether the bat is a savanna or a forest species, then the foraging guild, and then the roosts coming in last place. This was turned upside down on its head, as it were, and the bat team, the bat experts, they thought that by far the most important aspect of bat's biology when it comes to how it will respond to land use change is its roosting behavior. And so this slide here shows just some of the roosts that we would find in Africa. There's a cave on the left. It's actually not a cave, it's an old mine adit, but you know the sort of habitat that I'm referring to there. Some bats roost in crevices and have, as a result, done very well in human landscapes, roosting in buildings, melosids by the thousands in some places. Large trees provide roosts for certain bats. That's a tree I photographed in Ghana that is full of eidolon roosting. And then road culverts here is another example of bats that require shelter, but are a little bit more flexible. So flexibility in roosting was thought to be the most important thing here, that some bats are not flexible in their roosts and the type of roost that they select, whereas other bats are more flexible. And they may use, in some cases, a cave. In another case, the same species could, because it's flexible, could use an overhang or a culvert or something like that. So roosts were one aspect that was critical, especially whether it's an obligate or a more flexible roost species. Next slide, please, Hayley.
Oh, sorry, I seem to not be able to change it. I'm not sure what's just happened. I'm just going to, apologies, stop sharing and reshare because it doesn't seem to be liking this anymore.
Maybe it's just me and you talking to each other, Hayley. Maybe we've been.
Maybe it is. Let's hope not. Okay. Apologies. That's so strange. I don't know what happened, but let's try again. There we go. Can you see that, Ara?
Yes. Okay. Thanks very much. So the second aspect that the 24 experts thought we should take into consideration is the foraging guild of the bat. And this graph, I think, is familiar to most bat people. It shows aspect ratio on the y-axis, wing loading on the x-axis. Aspect ratio describes the shape of a bat, and the higher the aspect ratio, in other words, moving up from the bottom to the top, the wings tend to get longer and narrower. On the x-axis, it's wing loading. It's basically how heavy is the bat for a certain area of wing area. And 4 distinct groups are recognized, at least in Africa. And those are the, and maybe Hayley, you can start bringing these up one by one.
Yep.
So the clutter bats, bats like Rhinolophus that live in forest or dense or forage in forests or dense situations. Those are the clutter bats with low aspect ratio, low wing loading, and then the clutter edge or edge bats. these are typically species like many of the vespers. They tend to forage in the ecotone between forest or dense vegetation and more open vegetation, like you can see in that slide. The open air foraging guilds, next slide please, that's typically the molluskids as well as the emboloneurids. They forage above the vegetation, in this case a sugarcane field. And then the last group, the fourth group, is the fruit bats, which are defined by the long distances that they need to commute between where they roost and where they find fruiting trees. Fruiting trees are ephemeral. They appear and disappear in the landscape, and as a result, the bats need to they need to travel long distances to get to their feeding spots. So based on these two aspects, the roost requirements and the foraging guild, we came up with these 10 bat groups. And I'll just go through each group because you are all interested in bats, I suspect, and would like to know more about this slide than some of the previous slides I showed. So the first group are those that, in terms of roosting, they are obligate deep cave species, and in terms of foraging guilds, they forage in a cluttered environment, in a forest or a canopy of a tree and such like. There's typically, in that example, that's a Rhinolophus, and that genus fits this description very well. Most species in that genus will fit this description quite well. The second group, that's the obligate deep cave, but in this case now edge species. That's a photo of a Miniopterus. They roost in caves, but they tend to forage more in edge situations as opposed to clutter. Obligate deep cave, but fruit bat, Rosetus aegyptiacus, and what used to be Lysonycterus angolensis, now Myonicterus angolensis. That's examples of that group. The fourth group, these are now still cave dwelling. We will call them cave dwelling, but they also and they're clutter species, but they're flexible in their cave roost requirements. Like Nycteris, like some species of Hipposiderus, they will roost sometimes in caves, sometimes in just shallow overhangs, sometimes in an old barn, sometimes under a bridge or a culvert. Group 5, this was a little bit of a tricky group to conceptualize. We've called this the flexible crevice roosting bats, and here's an example of a Carivula. Placotus is also in this group. These are clutter species, and as you know, many Carivulas will roost in bird nests, but some of them also in other situations. Then there's the flexible crevice roosting bats that are edge species, such as Scotophilus. Group 7, these are the flexible crevice but open air foragers like the molluskids. Group 8, these are species that typically roost on tree trunks or rock faces, and they are open air foragers such as emboloneurids. Group 9, this is species that roost in foliage, typically under the bark of a tree, or in some cases in small hollows in the tree, but they forage in edge habitats such as many of the vesper bats. And then group 10, these are basically the fruit bats that roost in foliage. So these are the 10 groups, and the groups, you will notice immediately, these are well, actually, you may not notice this immediately, but these are not taxon-specific groups. There are some where it happens to be so, like group 7, those are the molluskids. But for group 1, for example, it's not just Rhinolophus in there, it's also Trianops, for example. Many Hipposideris are in there, and so on. So this was the biggest challenge that we faced, because most of us as bat biologists, we tend to think taxonomically. We like to group species by family and by genus. And it was a difficult exercise to try and break out of that mold and to see, from an ecological point of view, how can we group these bats? These groupings are not perfect. We realize that, and there are some complications. But we thought, as a generalization, this was a pretty good way to group these bats for an ecological study as like this one. Next slide, please.
It's doing this thing again where it doesn't want to change. Okay, there we go.
So this is basically the results. I've got 2 or 3 slides of results to show you, and then I'll hand back over to Hayley to wrap it up. So if you remember, there were 10 land use types. The first one was the reference land use type, which was a large, well-managed protected area. So that one is not being shown here. These are the remaining landscape types, the 9 of them. And I just want to explain very quickly what each one is showing. So if you look at the top left graph, the one that's called dense urban, on the y-axis, that's the impact score. A 0 means that no bats of that group will occur in that landscape. A 1 means that the bats will occur at the same abundances as if it was a natural area or pre-industrial area. But remember that these are the opinions of 24 bat experts. So these are opinions. This is not necessarily what the reality is. That's the first thing I want. That's the first comment I want to make. Note that on the x-axis, those are the 10 bat response groups that we talked about. The cave dwellers, the Rhinolophus on the far left, and then going through all those 10 groups to the fruit bats that roost in foliage on the far right. Now, there are two things that I want to draw your attention to here. Firstly, the first thing is that if we compare different land use types, we see that there's actually quite a lot of variation between the different land uses. Just compare that dense urban, which is in the top left, with the near natural, which is in the bottom center. In the near natural, the bats are all sitting at around 0.75–80% level, which means that we expect bats to be at around 80% abundances compared to pre-industrial times. But if you look at the dense urban, it's showing a very different picture. And for many of these different comparisons, there are different trends that come up. If you look at the tree crop plantation, which is the graph smack in the middle, you see it shows a different trend again to either near natural or to the dense urban. So this is one thing that took me a little, no, not that it took me by surprise, but I was pleasantly surprised to see this. We didn't end up with all the land uses looking exactly the same, which would have suggested that perhaps the exercise didn't go as well as it should have. So seeing these differences is great. The other thing I wanted to point out is that within any one land use, and if we go back to the dense urban in the top left, there are quite distinct differences between the different response groups, those 10 response groups of bats. So for example, in the dense urban, the first 5 groups, from cave clutter to crevice clutter, the respondents did not feel that these bats would do very well in a dense urban environment, occurring at abundances at most about 20% of what we would expect them to be. But the flexible edge and the flexible open, which are basically the vespers and the molluskids, they seem to do a lot better than the first four. And the last three are somewhere in between. Also notice the error bars. The vertical lines show error bars, and the shorter those lines, the less the error bar, which means there's less variation between the different, those 24 experts. In other words, there was great consensus or agreement in those opinions. And on the whole, if you look at all of these graphs, there is, the error bars are relatively small, and where the error bars are not small, that is actually quite interesting. Like the flexible open, the group 7 typically has large error bars, and this could be either because the experiences of the 24 differ with respect to this group, or it could be that we have lumped species that shouldn't have been lumped together into one group, and therefore there was uncertainty as to how to score that group. So next slide, please. So in the previous slide, what we were showing was the impact scores for each land use with the bats, the response bats responding within each land use. This graph is now showing it's the same data, but we're taking just one example, one of those 10 bat groups. This is the obligate deep cave bats, and looking at how this one group of bats responds, or at least how the opinions of the experts think they respond across those 9 different land use types. And again, the thing I want to draw your attention to, okay, let me just explain very quickly. This is a box plot. A box plot, the box in the center, that's basically the first quartile to the third quartile that has 50% of all the data points in it. The thick horizontal line is the median. The vertical lines show the 99% of the estimates, and then the few black dots above or below show the outliers, the 1% that are lying beyond that. So two things I want you to get out for. Ignore the colorful yellow dots for now. Sorry, the colorful circles for now. Just focus, imagine they're not there, just look at those box plots. And what's interesting here is that for many of the land use types, the variability is very low. So in other words, there was a lot of agreement. In dense urban centers, we do not expect to find obligate deep cave bats, generally speaking, across Africa. In large scale crops, the same is true. In fact, in most of those categories, we do not expect to find a lot of these bats, with the exception perhaps of smallholder crops and of course the near natural. So the second thing I want to draw your attention to are those colorful circles now. Each color represents a different region in Africa. The red, for example, is across is the views of an expert that is commenting based on experience across the continent. The yellows are experts that are familiar with East Africa, and so on. The legend is up at the top there. Now, what I want you to look at here is the reason that we plotted this was to look to see, are there major differences between the different regions of Africa? For example, what is true for Southern Africa perhaps is not true for West Africa. And that would be clear if on the y-axis, which is the impact score, if the colors separated out on the y-axis. In other words, if all the southern points, which are the light green, if they were all at the bottom, whereas the west, the blue points were all at the top, then we would say they are, what is true in Southern Africa is not necessarily true in West Africa. But if you look at these, you don't see any obvious trend. Those colors are all mixed up nicely together, suggesting that the response groups that we agreed on, those bats are responding similarly across the regions of Africa. Or let me put it again, the correct way, the opinion of the experts is that those bats are responding the same across the continent. So the next slide, please. I think it's my last, this is my last slide. So you might be interested to know, how did the 9 different land use groups fare compared to protected areas? This may not be much of a surprise to you. The near natural areas did the best with small error bars, and the experts thought that the abundances of bats in such situations are pretty close to what you would expect in pre-industrial times. Then there's 3 groups after that tend to group out together. The non-intensive smallholder crops, the tree crops, and the mixed settlements. They are slightly higher than the next 3, which are the intensive rangelands, timber plantations, and intensive large-scale croplands. And then finally, the worst of the lot are the dense urban centers. But what I want you to notice are the very large error bars here. And for example, look at the mixed settlements. Look at how large those error bars are. Now remember what we've done here. We've taken 10 different response groups of bats, and we've lumped them together and calculated a mean. In the mixed settlements, some groups we think do very well, such as the molluskids, such as the vespers. Some groups do very poorly, such as the obligate cave roosting clutterbats in the rhinolophids and such like. So lumping all those together is going to give us these large error bars. So with that, I'll hand it back to Hayley to finish off.
Thanks very much, Ara. So just a couple of final words from me, just to reiterate some of the general reflections. Firstly, it was promising that we saw this fair degree of consensus between experts, but that also variability is important to interrogate, particularly if that highlights areas where maybe further research is needed, where we still have a high degree of uncertainty. And again, that uncertainty is higher in certain landscapes, but also in certain groups of species. Secondly, intensity of land use matters, and this is perhaps obvious, but really important to demonstrate, because a lot of these large-scale studies, aggregated indices, just report urban versus cropland versus rangeland, etc. And really, how intensive those landscapes are, smallholder versus large-scale, make a big difference. And then, of course, some groups of bats cope much better than others on average. And then just to talk about next steps. So this is one component of the research. We're busy rolling the same process out for the other groups. We then will be publishing a data paper with these results, co-authored by all the participating experts, to get that information out there. And then we will use that to determine the Biodiversity Intactness Index for Africa. But we also hope that that data itself, those expert opinions about the impact of different land uses on different groups of species, will spark discussion. Maybe people will disagree, maybe it will be useful for informing models or other work that they're trying to do, and hopefully it'll also spark interest in undertaking more empirical studies to actually go out and collect the data that would allow us to test some of these hypotheses, essentially. So with that, I will hand back to Elisa.
Thanks, Hayley. That was really, really interesting. An excellent talk and really interesting results coming up. We have a few minutes for questions, and we have some on the chat already. So I'll just read some of them out, either to you or Ara, whoever wants to answer. So Rachel asks, across all the taxa groups, were there any surprises, for example, vulnerable groups or winners?
I think that is a better question for Ara to answer.
So, no, I don't think there were any surprises as such, but there were a lot of very difficult groups. I think that for me, the surprise was more in the fact that the error bars on all those graphs were so low. In other words, there was a lot of consensus between the different experts, even though all of the work was done independently. The experts did not sit around a table and discuss, should this bat get a 0.7 or should it get a 0.5? Everyone went off. In my case, it took me hours and hours to fill out the bat form. And that was with no discussion with anybody else. And I was very surprised to see just how much consensus there was, generally speaking. To me, that was the real surprise.
We have another question, a few questions from Francesca. She asks, which classification did you use to get the 9 broad African landscape types?
Yeah, so that is a good question, and we're still looking at ultimately what we think is going to be the best data to map this back onto the continent. So that map that I showed you is based on a combination of data sets. Actually, the one is the HIDE data set, which differentiates urban versus cropland versus rangeland versus natural land based on also other data sets that it pulls together and the percentage coverage that they have of each of those pixels. We then had to find separate data for the plantations because that's unfortunately not in the HIDE data. So those data came from the Global Forest Watch, and also I found a more recent paper that I tried to map oil palm plantations in particular in West Africa. So it's a combination of data sets really trying to capture the best that we have available. And of course, you know, those are limited in of themselves. So my hope is that also once we publish the impact scores, you know, once better land covered data becomes available, we'll be able to better map those impact scores based on back onto what's happening on the ground across the continent.
Great. Francesca also asks, where did you find abundant species data for African bats? Or is this so? Is this based on just the opinion of the experts, or did you have any abundance data?
Yeah, so that's correct, and I think there's another question here I can answer related to that about how do we ground truth these. And so what we've reported on here, the results that Ara showed you, is based purely on expert opinion of what the relative impact on abundance would be. So data itself did not inform what we showed you, but of course, many of the experts that contributed have collected data themselves that helped in various forms in various different landscapes that helped to inform their estimates. So in that sense, there's data that helps to inform expert opinion, but not data that informs exactly what we've shown you. This is one way to synthesize that information as well as observation, etc. And then related to that, how will we ground truth this? So the reason we're doing it by expected elicitation is because there is not a lot of good comparable abundance data across the continent. There is some, for example, in the predicts database, and that's also why we classified landscapes in a similar way to them, so that where there is data, empirical data, we can plot that and see where it falls relative to ours. I'm nervous about using the term ground truth because in some ways, empirical data can be difficult to compare as well. Landscapes are different. You have to compare it relative to a natural site. Sampling rates are different. Sampling protocols are different, etc. So I think of it more as a way to compare, and hopefully we see trends that are similar. That would be reassuring. So that is a process that we will still be going through.
That's great. Thank you very much for that answer. We have another question from Jonathan asking, with the exception of near natural lands, which I assume make up much less proportion of the continent than the other land types combined, are the results concerning to you? So are most of the continent, bats don't seem to be doing very well. Any comment on that?
Yeah, good question. And I think, this is the importance of doing these kinds of studies to really say, hey, everybody, look what's going on. This is important. We need to think about this. And so the big land, in terms of coverage, the big land uses in Africa are croplands. A lot of that is small holder compared to large scale. So that at least is promising. And then also the rangeland to near natural land. So I think there is still hope. Those are still large extents of land. But then it's also important, messages around, smallholder croplands are much better than intensive croplands. So how do we enable processes where we don't see intensification across the continent, etc. So yes, it's never nice to demonstrate biodiversity loss, but I think important to do so to spread that message. I don't know if Ara would like to speak to that for bats specifically.
Sorry, I was responding to Francesca's question about the bat book. Okay. No, I don't have anything specific to say further than that.
I was just going to ask, this is just because of my own research area, which is very much focused on restoration efforts and how that can benefit not just bats, but other biodiversity as well. So I noticed most of the kind of land categories that you had were related to kind of land degradation. And I was just interested in whether or not you've been looking or are planning on looking at kind of the other side of the coin, at restoration or reforestation efforts and how that might benefit these species groups.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think an important positive messaging to switch this on its head and really demonstrate the importance of restoration. So for this project specifically, as you say, we don't have a landscape that's like secondary forest or restored forest or non-forest, purely because it's really challenging to map that onto landscapes on the ground. So there's compromises happening on all scales here in terms of, lumping species together because we can't do them all separately, thinking about what are the main categories of landscape, because otherwise, Ara already said this took quite a lot of time. So we don't specifically ask experts to estimate in restored context how that would influence abundance. But of course, you can work backwards. As intensity decreases or land goes back to natural, we transition back to some of the more natural categories. So I think in terms of messaging, I think that is a really nice way of also articulating this.
And possibly a nice way to finish off the webinar today on a kind of positive note, thinking about restoration rather than land degradation. So thanks very much again, Hayley and Ara, for a really interesting and enlightening talk. There are lots of comments saying thank you and great talk. So I think people really appreciate your time here. Thanks everyone for joining us during today's webinar. And I hope you can join us again over the coming weeks for the upcoming seminars. And I wish you all a great rest of the day. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all being here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.